Hello, I'm Sarah Vickerstaff from the University of Kent, and I'm talking today about a project that's been going for the last 3 years, which I lead, but there's researchers from very many other universities, including Manchester, Brighton, Edinburgh, Bath and Leeds Metropolitan. And the project's been looking at what we've called uncertain futures, managing late careers and extended working lives. And the project's a mixed method project, so we've been using longitudinal data sets like ELSA, the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, the American HRS Health and Retirement Survey, and also the 1958 birth cohort study, so that's one element of the project. And then also we've done 5 organisational case studies. And the motivation for the project really was in the context of all the policy change there has been to encourage people to work for longer. So we've had age discrimination legislation, the removal of a mandatory retirement age, the extension of the right to request flexible working to all employees, and of course we've seen state pension ages rising. In this context, there's an expectation and even an urge from the government for people to work for longer. And there's, if you like, a popular assumption that we're living longer, therefore we should be working for longer. But our starting point was that the idea that everybody will be working for longer was really rather more uncertain than perhaps the popular view suggests. So we wanted to look at the data sets and see whether people were working for longer, but also the kinds of pathways and transitions they make in older age. There's a lot of talk of people unretiring, of retiring and then coming back into work, or retiring gradually, or using flexible work options to vary their pathways in later working life. And we really wanted to test out the extent to which this is happening and also the constraints on that. So through the quantitative data sets, we did some sequence analysis and we looked at the pathways that people move through. So we were looking at full-time employment, part-time employment, unemployment, inactivity, and sort of seeing what steps people make at the end of their working lives. And what we found through this was that in fact, cliff edge retirement, as it used to be called, where people men work full-time and then stop working, is still the norm. And for women in this country, in the UK, working part-time and then stopping is still the typical pattern. So there's not in the quantitative data as much evidence of more fluid or flexible work endings as is often talked about. So that was a part of the quantitative side, just tracking the pathways people are taking, which then gave us a pause, made us think, well, perhaps not so much has changed, perhaps people are still taking rather traditional paths to retirement. So then we wanted to track that in organisations, because of course people don't retire in the abstract, they retire from their employing organisation. And a lot of those policy changes I mentioned, things like age discrimination, flexibility, really puts the onus on employers to be retaining people longer into older ages than they may have done in the past, or indeed recruiting people at older ages. So we wanted to look at what some organisations were actually doing. So we looked at 5 organisations, a range to get a sense of what might be happening in different sectors. We looked at local government, a mineral extraction company, a manufacturing and engineering company, a hospitality organisation, and a transport or train operating company. So very different organisational settings, different kinds of workforces, to see how those organisations were responding to an ageing workforce. We interviewed managers, HR managers, occupational health people, employees, and also trade unionists where they were present, to really get a rounded view of what extending working lives looks like at the organisational level. And as I said a moment ago, we think that a lot of the policy change has really put pressure on employers to retain their older workers and to respond to the extending working life agenda. But what we found was that there weren't very many specific initiatives addressed to older people. And indeed, age discrimination legislation was seen by employers as a barrier to doing anything special for older workers, because it might be deemed as discriminatory. So some of our employers were very good. They had good well-being initiatives, they offered flexibility, but none of this was specifically focused on the particular situation of older workers. So we weren't seeing too much change in employer behaviour. Then we looked at the whole question of flexibility, which is often seen as an option that might encourage people to work longer if they don't have to work full throttle and then stop work, but can perhaps downshift or reduce their hours or possibly enter a formal phased or gradual retirement scheme, that this might encourage people to work longer. And a lot of policy documents are very favourable about the positive benefits of flexible work. So this was something we wanted to explore because we hadn't found it in the quantitative data. Could we find it in the qualitative case studies? Well, we didn't find much of it there either. None of our organisations had were monitoring requests for flexibility by age. There was still a general feeling from HR managers in all of the organisations that flexibility was something that primarily women with smaller children were seeking. Didn't particularly see it as something that older workers were going to be interested in. When we talked to employees, there was very widespread support and interest in the idea of gradual retirement, being able to phase down. Almost everybody thought that that would be a great idea, but very, very few people had actually asked whether they'd be able to do it. Or a lot of people said, well, I would love to do that, but I can't afford to do it. So certainly for the lower paid people, a phased retirement wasn't feasible because they couldn't afford to take a pay cut before they retired, before they got to state pension age. And for other people, there were often constraints about the nature of the job they did. On the trains, for example, there's a feeling that that's a full-time job, again in mineral extraction. These are traditional male full-time jobs. Line managers, employees themselves couldn't get their heads around the idea that you might do it part-time. In the train operating company, there were some job shares if people could match, if train drivers could match with somebody else in the same depot that wanted a job share, but they were very limited. So in some areas of work, flexible work, there are barriers to it in terms of the way work is organised. Line managers may not be very keen on it, so there might be a nice policy at the organisational level, but it's not really feeding down to practice. Also for women, a lot of women were working flexibly already, were working part-time hours. So more flexibility was potentially more feasible. They could do slightly less hours than the hours they were currently doing, but wasn't necessarily attractive, again, for financial reasons. So the qualitative work, along with the quantitative work, really means that we need to think about simply imagining, because people have a right to request flexible work, either that they know they've got that right, or if they know they've got it, that they are actually empowered to ask about it, but also whether it's actually feasible. And for a lot of middle and lower income people, the idea of reducing your income before you get to receipt of pension is simply not feasible. Another thing we looked at was discussions around retirement, and here we found another very odd effect of age discrimination legislation, that generally the organisations were saying we can't talk to anybody about retirement now. Because of age discrimination legislation, you can't raise the issue of retirement. And we got this from HR departments, and we got it from line managers, and indeed from employees themselves, that said things like, oh, I know nobody can talk to me about retirement. Well, of course, this is a very defensive and wrong interpretation of age discrimination legislation. The effect it was having was actually to cause a lot of uncertainty on all sides. Uncertainty for managers because they didn't know how long people were going to carry on working. So they couldn't really plan for succession. They couldn't plan for replacing people if they weren't sure when they would go. In the old days with the mandatory retirement age, they would know if people carried on working that they would go at 65 or whatever the mandatory retirement age was for that organisation. Without that, they don't know. And we had an example again in the trains of a line manager saying, well, I like to go to sort of birthday parties in the mess room because I sometimes then hear people saying, oh, I think I'll only work for a couple more years. So it was a very informal way of finding out what was actually going on, which of course wasn't very useful for the organisations in terms of planning their staffing and managing their staffing. So it wasn't working for employers not to know when people were retiring. But it wasn't working for employees either, because they actually wanted to talk to someone about what their options were and to get some advice and to talk it through. And were expecting the organisation to give them this information. And it was put very sharply by someone in the manufacturing case who sort of said, well, they're waiting for us to talk to them about retirement. What they don't realise is that they've got to come and tell us that they're going to resign. Because without a mandatory age, that's essentially what people do. They decide not to carry on working, they resign. Of course, that's a terrible mismatch of understandings and expectations. People nearing the end of their working lives and thinking about retirement aren't thinking to themselves, oh, I think I might resign next April. They're thinking about retirement as that sort of important signal moment with social significance. It's not the same as a resignation. So we found quite a lot of employees who were feeling rather insecure, not knowing quite what they were going to do, not knowing who to talk about it. So there was a lot of confusion around the limits that age discrimination legislation puts on discussions that managers can have with their employees, which is not working for anybody. So it's really very important that employers are enabled to understand how they can have those kinds of conversations. And then a final thing we looked at was the impact of rising state pension ages. As we know, state pension age has risen quite rapidly for women, and it's now rising for both men and women. And certainly for our lower paid workers in hospitality and also in manufacturing, there was a lot of concern and anxiety about whether they would be able to carry on working. So these were people for whom the state pension was going to be a critical element of their retirement income. So they couldn't afford to retire until they got their state pension. But the state pension age was disappearing off into the distance. So especially in hospitality, so this is people doing cleaning jobs and catering jobs, physically hard jobs. A lot of the women there were very worried about their ability to carry on cleaning. This is women in their late 50s, early 60s, many of whom had arthritis and other sorts of conditions, and they were really worrying about that. To such an extent, in some cases, people were hiding health conditions, worried that if they revealed their knees were shot, and went off and had an operation on them, that they might lose their job, and they couldn't afford to do that because of the financial situation. So another thing that came out, along with this uncertainty about when retirement might happen, who you can talk to about it, that for some groups, those who don't have strong occupational pensions, who haven't got long lifetimes earnings, who are going to be very dependent on the state pension, the moving of the state pension age was a really dramatic policy change in terms of how they were thinking and managing their later careers. So to conclude then, what have we found out in this study? We found that perhaps there's not been as much change as we might have imagined there would be, given how many policy developments there have been. Organisations haven't really started to think very coherently about an ageing workforce. There are some dysfunctional effects of age discrimination legislation, which is obviously a good thing, but which is stopping conversations which people need and want to have about their retirement processes, and perhaps stopping organisations thinking about measures that might help older workers for fear that targeting a policy at older workers will be discriminatory. And then the other thing that we found out, of course, is that there's considerable inequality. People now have choice to carry on working. They can't be forced to retire at a particular age anymore, which is a good thing. But the ability to really activate that choice is very, very dependent upon your income, upon your health, and also upon the organisation that you work for.